What would you do if the world turned its back on you, but your heart refused to let go of the one thing that made you whole? For Clara Hensley, that thing was her bakery, Sweet Ember, a tiny haven on Maple Street where the scent of fresh bread and vanilla had once drawn crowds. It wasn't just a business, it was her soul, kneaded into every loaf, every delicate pastry. But life has a way of crumbling even the sweetest dreams. And for Clara, it all began to unravel 3 years ago. Clara had built Sweet Ember from nothing. At 25, she'd poured her savings, her sleepless nights, and every ounce of her passion into that shop. It wasn't just about baking. It was about creating moments, first dates over coffee and croissants, birthday cakes that made children squeal, and warm scones that comforted grieving hearts. The town of Willow Creek loved her for it. They called her the bread angel, their smiles as warm as her ovens. But then came the fire. It wasn't her fault. A faulty wire, the fire marshal said, sparked in the middle of the night. By morning, Sweet Ember was a husk of charred wood and shattered glass. Clara stood in the ashes, her apron still tied on, staring at the ruins of her life. The insurance company dragged its feet, offering a payout that wouldn't cover half the rebuild. Her suppliers moved on. Her customers, sympathetic at first, drifted to the new chain bakery across town with its glossy signs and cheap muffins. Worst of all, her own family or parents, her brother urged her to let it go. "You're young," her mother said, voice gentle but firm. "Start over. This dream's dead." Even her best friend, Lila, who'd once helped her frost cupcakes until midnight, stopped calling. Clara was alone, written off as a failure who dared to dream too big. But Clara wasn't done. She couldn't be. Every night, she lay awake, the scent of phantom bread haunting her. She saw the faces of her customers, heard the laughter that once filled her shop. She wasn't just fighting for a business. She was fighting for herself. So, she made a choice, a bold, reckless, impossible choice. She'd rebuild Sweet Ember, no matter what it took. The first step was money. Clara sold her car, her grandmother's old ring, anything that wasn't nailed down. She worked double shifts at a diner, the kind of place where the coffee was bitter and the tips were worse. Every cent went into a jar labeled Ember. She scoured thrift stores for secondhand ovens, bargained with contractors, and taught herself to repair what she couldn't afford to replace. The townsfolk whispered. "She's crazy," they said, clinging to a lost cause. Even her landlord, Mr. Grayson, laughed when she begged for an extension on the lease. "You'll never make it, Clara," he said, shaking his head. "That shop's a ghost." Months bled into a year. Clara's hands grew calloused, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. There were days she wanted to quit, when the weight of doubt felt heavier than the flour sacks she hauled. But then came the twist. She never saw Kaminga's stranger named Amos. Amos was a wiry man in his 60s, with a limp and a voice like gravel. He showed up one rainy afternoon, peering through the boarded-up windows of Sweet Ember's ruins. Clara, covered in sawdust from sanding salvaged shelves, assumed he was another gawker. But Amos wasn't there to judge. "Heard you're bringing this place back," he said, his eyes sharp with something like recognition. "I'm a carpenter. Used to build for my wife's bakery before she passed. Let me help." Clara hesitated. She didn't trust easily anymore. But Amos didn't ask for pay, only for a chance to work. He showed up every day, fixing beams, carving new counters, teaching Clara tricks to make the space sturdier than before. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was about his wife, Ellie, and her bakery that had been their dream. "She'd have liked you," he said once, sanding a tabletop smooth. "You've got her kind of stubborn." Amos wasn't just a carpenter. He was a lifeline. His presence reminded Clara she wasn't alone, that her fight mattered. Together, they rebuilt Sweet Ember, board by board, brick by brick. The day they hung the new sign hand-carved by Amos, with sweet ember, in elegant script, Clara cried for the first time since the fire. It wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a promise kept. The grand reopening was set for a crisp autumn morning. Clara barely slept, her nerves buzzing like a live wire. She'd spent weeks perfecting new recipes: lavender honey brioche, pecan sticky buns, a chocolate tart with a salted caramel swirl. She'd painted the walls a warm ivory, hung fairy lights, and set out tables with mismatched chairs that somehow felt like home. But doubt gnawed at her. Would anyone come? Had the town forgotten her? At 7 a.m., she unlocked the door, her heart pounding. For the first hour, the shop was empty, the silence deafening. Clara stood behind a counter, her apron pristine, her hope fraying. Then, the bell above the door jingled. A woman walked in, Mrs. Carter, who'd once bought a cake for her daughter's wedding. "Clara," she said, her eyes wide. "You did it." She bought a loaf of rye and stayed to chat, her voice thick with pride. Word spread. By noon, a line formed. Old customers returned, their faces a mix of shock and awe. New faces appeared, drawn by the buzz. Lila showed up, tears in her eyes, whispering, "I'm so sorry I doubted you." Even Mr. Grayson, the landlord, came, his usual scowl replaced by a grudging nod. "Didn't think you had it in you," he muttered, buying a dozen cookies. The day was a blur of laughter, clinking coins, and the warm hum of ovens. Sweet Ember was alive again. But the real victory wasn't the crowd or the sales. It was the moment Clara caught Amos's eye across the room. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "You did it, kid." She realized then that this wasn't just her triumph. It was theirs. It was for every person who'd ever been written off, who'd been told their dream was too broken to fix. Months later, Sweet Ember was thriving. The chain bakery across town couldn't compete with Clara's heart, her recipes, her story. The townsfolk who'd once pitted her now bragged about our Clara to anyone who'd listen. Her family, once skeptical, now showed up every weekend, her brother boasting about her to his friends. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her bakery spoke for her. Clara learned something through it all. The boldest moves aren't the loudest ones. They're the quiet, stubborn choices to keep going, to believe when no one else does. She'd reclaimed more than her bakerish reclaimed herself. And in doing so, she'd shown Willow Creek, and maybe the world, that no one's story is over until they say it is. Amos still came by, though he worked less now, his limp worse in the cold. One day, as they shared a slice of her latest creation, a rosemary lemon scone, he said, "You know, Ellie would have said you're a fire that doesn't quit." Clara smiled, her eyes misty. She didn't need the town's approval anymore. She had her ovens, her bread, her heart, and that was enough.